When Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine in 2022, he radically severed his country's ties with much of the world. The global community's response was swift and harsh. Western nations imposed relentless sanctions targeting banks, businesses, and influential individuals. Diplomatic links were cut, and Moscow found itself isolated. The Kremlin's hopes for allies crumbled overnight. As the war dragged on, Russia's circle of supportive partners shrank even further. The once large pool of trade allies evaporated. In desperation, Beijing and New Delhi, Russia's last standing major trading partners, began to capitalize on Moscow's weakness. These nations are now systematically draining Russia of its remaining resources. Every day, Putin finds himself powerless to halt the bleeding. China, the world's second-largest economy, has been Russia's most consistent buyer of coal and crude oil throughout this conflict. Since 2022, trade between the two has exploded. Yet, Beijing refuses to openly condemn Putin's aggression. While China hasn't sent troops or supplied weapons, it is quietly fueling the war effort through vast financial and material support. Russia's economy is heavily dependent on Chinese investments, trade deals, and resources. Without this lifeline, the Russian economy might crumble completely. The war itself could become impossible to sustain. An insider from the Russian government confirmed this. They revealed that without Chinese aid, Russia would lack the technology, missiles, drones, even basic manufacturing. The war might be over in an instant. China is fully aware of its crucial position. It wields immense influence over Moscow's fate. Now, China is exploiting that power fully, stretching Russia's financial limits. Recent reports show Chinese exporters are hiking prices for dual-use goods, products that can be civilian or military. Drones, encryption software, navigation systems, and chemicals, these are the essentials for war. China has been shipping over $300 million worth of such high-priority goods to Russia annually. That's a staggering figure, nearly doubling from previous months. They're not just supplying Russia, they're profiteering from the conflict. Many of these supplies include microelectronics, radar, sensors, and optical components, critical for building advanced weapons, missiles, tanks, drones. Since Russia can't produce these on its own, it relies on imports. Only a handful of countries, like Turkey, Malaysia, Armenia, and China, are willing to supply more than 1% of these critical imports. China dominates this small group. By raising prices, China ensures Moscow pays a heavy toll for what it needs. Between 2021 and 2024, the cost of dual-use goods in Russia surged by 87%. Meanwhile, other countries saw only a 9% increase. Russia is paying 3 times more for essential supplies compared to the rest of the world. This strategic move? It's crippling Moscow's ability to sustain the war. Western sanctions, initially designed to choke Russia's economy, have had a surprising side effect. They've driven prices sky-high for key resources. Experts say this has made it much harder for Russia to buy what it needs. The cost puts a squeeze on their military machine. The destruction is staggering. Over 4,200 tanks, nearly 9,000 armored vehicles, hundreds of artillery pieces annihilated. Repairing or replacing these assets consumes massive resources. While Russia has ramped up its own production in some areas, it remains heavily dependent on imported components. Microelectronics and optical devices come mostly from China, which now supplies about 89% of these essentials, up from 32% in 2021. Yet, despite this dependence, Moscow's leaders grow increasingly wary of Beijing's true intentions. Behind closed doors, insiders admit China isn't truly an ally. They complain of broken promises, exploitation, even outright theft. The once strong bond is more transactional than friendly. But China isn't the only nation playing this dangerous game. Turkey has also raised prices, demanding 25 to 55% more for Russian imports. Meanwhile, India, once a major supporter, now shows clear signs of backing away. Recent deals reveal Russia offering oil at record low prices just to sell a fraction of what it once could. The threat intensifies. As Russia bleeds resources and tumbles deeper into economic chaos, the question remains, how much longer can Moscow sustain this war? And who truly pulls the strings behind the scenes? The power shifts happening now could determine the future of global stability itself. As Western sanctions tighten, China's role in Russia's survival becomes ever more critical. Without Chinese support, Russia's entire economy might have crumbled long ago, and the war could have ended in defeat. Yet, China remains silent, the true kingmaker in this deadly game. How powerful is its influence? How much longer can Russia keep this fragile dependency going? Recent findings from the Bank of Finland's Institute for New Economies reveal alarming trends. Chinese exporters are raising prices for dual-use goods, products that can serve both civilian life and military warfare. These include drones used for recreation or deployed on the battlefield, encryption software, navigation systems, chemicals, and more. The supplies are pouring into Russia, each shipment a vital piece in Moscow's war machine. In 2024, a comprehensive report from Carnegie Politics identified that China exported over $300 million worth of these strategic dual-use items to Russia, still lower than the $600 million of December 2023, but staggering nonetheless. China has become Russia's primary supplier of technology necessary for building missile systems, drones emerging from the shadows of denial and silence. These components include microelectronics, radar, sensors, and optical devices. Russia's domestic industries lack the capacity, they're running out of options. Trade routes now hinge on a handful of nations willing to take the risk. Only Turkey, Malaysia, Armenia, and China are providing more than 1% of Russia's essential imports. Among them, China's dominance is undeniable. It's capable of mass-producing the critical parts Russia cannot manufacture itself, yet, at what cost? The trade deals are becoming increasingly expensive, with prices skyrocketing by nearly 87% between 2021 and 2024. Meanwhile, the cost for other nations has only risen by 9%. Why is it so costly? Because Western sanctions are pushing Moscow into a corner. Without these restrictions, Russia could access a broader range of suppliers or develop its own capabilities. But the sanctions hamper progress, forcing Russia into a treacherous dependence on China's goods, costly, fragile, and driven by an unspoken power dynamic. Every dollar spent on these goods is a gamble that could decide the fate of the conflict. Russia's military assets are suffering catastrophic losses, over 4,200 tanks and thousands of vehicles destroyed. Repairing or replacing them demands resources beyond Russia's reach. Their dependence on China for microelectronics and optical devices has grown from a third of their needs to nearly 90%, deepening their reliance every day. Yet, not all Russians trust this relationship. Insiders across Moscow whisper of betrayal. China's actions are unpredictable and often exploitative. Supplies are sometimes halted. Payments are delayed. They don't act like allies, a high-ranking source confesses. Sometimes, it's outright theft. The political alliance remains fragile, a ticking time bomb amid the chaos. Meanwhile, Turkey has started to hike prices, demanding 25% to 55% more than other nations. India, the second largest partner, is growing wary. Recently, Russia began offering its crude oil at bargain prices, an attempt to keep the dwindling alliance afloat. Yet, even these desperate measures carry risks, as dependencies deepen and costs soar. The question remains, how long can this delicate balance hold? With each passing day, the scales tilt more in China's favor. The war's sustainability hangs on this fragile web of reliance and exploitation. As Moscow's supplies grow more expensive and scarce, will they find a way out? Or has China's strategic silence sealed Russia's fate? Following the path of darkness, Russia's reliance on a shrinking circle of trade partners grows even more desperate. In 2023, only 4 nations, Turkey, Malaysia, Armenia, and China, supplied more than 1% of Moscow's critical imports. Among them, China stands tall, not just as a major supplier but as Russia's lifeline in a crippled economy. This dominant position leaves Beijing wielding unmatched power, capable of producing the essential products Russia cannot forge on its own, and willing to keep trading despite mounting international pressure. What's chilling is how Chinese suppliers have begun to increase prices by a staggering 87% over just 3 years for dual-use goods like drones, microelectronics, and military components, while other nations' prices have risen by only 9%. Imagine the feeling of the cold metal of a drone or a missile sensor. Now imagine paying twice or even 3 times as much for it. Russia's financial strain is escalating each day. To secure these must-have items, the Kremlin is forced to loosen its purse strings, paying a deadly premium to keep its war machine running. Meanwhile, some crucial components, like ball bearings, have become so expensive that Russia is reducing its purchases, dropping exports by 13% from China even as prices soar, a clear sign of being priced out. This direct consequence of Western sanctions is more than economic. It's strategic, a slow strangulation of Russia's war effort. Without punitive measures, Moscow could choose its trade partners freely, fueling its military ambitions with a wide array of domestic and foreign resources. But sanctions have changed the game entirely. Now, China's willingness to supply comes with a dark price, a leverage that leaves the Kremlin trembling. This shift isn't lost on world observers. The more Russia struggles to purchase vital technology and materials, the more it depends on its Asian neighbor. A total reliance that grants China unprecedented influence, able to demand higher prices and restrict supplies at will. And yet, if the sanctions were lifted, everything could change overnight. Russia might rebuild its industries, produce its own microchips and optical drives, and break free from dependence, or so it seems. But then comes the twist and ominous question. Is this dependency a trap the Kremlin cannot escape? With each passing month, the price tag rises, and options dwindle. The world watches as the price of war grows, not just in lives, but in the silent cost of domination, where the strongest holds the strings, and the vanishing hope of independence flickers on the horizon. What's next for a Russia increasingly bound by the chains of its own strategic weakness? Following the harsh sanctions, Russia's ability to independently produce vital military and dual-use technology has been severely hampered. Without restrictions, the nation could have bolstered its own industries, manufacturing essential components at home. But now, Beijing holds all the power, dictating the prices Moscow must pay, regardless of how astronomical they rise. The Financial Times reports that the impact of these sanctions is intensifying. Exporters are demanding higher premiums, exploiting Russia's desperation. The prices for critical goods have soared by nearly 87% between 2021 and 2024. Meanwhile, other nations see the cost hike and hesitate to supply Russia at all, further strangling its options. This development spells disaster for Russia's war effort. The military machine is hemorrhaging equipment, over 4,200 tanks destroyed, along with thousands of armored vehicles, artillery systems, and missile launchers. Each piece was costly, difficult to replace, and now Russia struggles to keep its battered forces operational. Its dependence on external sources for microelectronics, optical devices, and sophisticated weapons components makes every purchase a gamble with unpredictable prices. Despite attempts to ramp up domestic manufacturing, Moscow remains vastly behind. Their inability to produce high-tech components, especially microchips, means reliance on China skyrocketed from 32% to almost 89% of their imports. Imagine that dependency. What once seemed a strategic partnership now feels like a chokehold. One Russian insider recently admitted to Reuters that China doesn't act like an ally. Sometimes it cheats, sometimes it stops payments, sometimes it outright steals. The twist? China's role in this geopolitical chess game is far more calculated than many realize. While Beijing refrains from openly aiding the invasion with weapons, it funds the war indirectly through resource trade, profiting from the chaos. They are strategically raising prices on dual-use goods like drones, encryption software, and radar components, knowing full well how vital these products are for Moscow's war machine. The world's second-largest economy is wielding this leverage masterfully. A recent report shows China is exporting over $300 million worth of these high-priority items to Russia, up from 2023, with prices nearly doubling. Meanwhile, Russia's buying power diminishes, their costs rise by 87%, while other nations see just a 9% increase. This means Moscow must shell out far more for resources vital to sustain their military. And the bills keep piling up. Russia's costs to acquire critical parts like ball bearings have surged by 76%. Their purchase volumes have shrunk by 13%. The sanctions, intended to weaken Russia, now serve as a tool for China to impose a financial vice, squeezing the Kremlin with every transaction. This process is not subtle, it's destructive. It's a slow collapse driven by economic strangulation that Moscow can't escape. Had there been no sanctions, Russia could have turned to more diverse partners or even strengthened their own industries. They could have manufactured crucial components domestically, saving billions and potentially prolonging the conflict indefinitely. Now, with Beijing calling the shots, they are forced to pay exorbitant prices, transforming the war effort into a costly, unsustainable endeavor. Western officials highlight a stark reality: the combined effect of these sanctions might be the most effective weapon of all. The high premiums China demands are effectively limiting Russia's access to vital supplies. If prices continue to climb, Moscow's military infrastructure will crumble under the weight of unavailability and financial strain. The cost of war isn't just measured in money, it's in shattered tanks, lost soldiers, and a grinding, inevitable decline. The staggering losses are undeniable. Over 4,200 tanks destroyed, countless armored vehicles, artillery, and missile systems rendered useless or damaged. Restoring these assets would require enormous resources Russia no longer has. Their dependency on Chinese technology for microelectronics, sensors, and optical devices has grown from 32% to a staggering 89%, exposing a dangerous weakness. All the while, some insiders remain skeptical about China's true intentions. One source close to the Kremlin admitted publicly that Beijing often acts in its own interest, sometimes betraying Moscow entirely. It's a bitter realization: the price of international isolation is that your so-called allies become your bosses. Moscow is increasingly cornered, unable to pay their way out of this economic mess, with China pulling the strings, demanding more, getting less, and watching the collapse unfold. This is the unthinkable twist in the story of power and control. The very nations Russia depended upon are now only tightening the noose, bleeding Moscow dry, and setting the stage where victory becomes less and less plausible. The war has already turned into a war of economics, one cruelly designed to outlast its enemies and crush their will to fight. Imagine waking up to a world where your most vital friends suddenly demand triple the price for essentials. Your very survival depends on it. That's Russia's nightmare today, as allies turn exploitative, stripping their defenses bare. Flashback to 2022, the air thick with diesel fumes, the rumble of tanks shaking the ground like distant thunder, as Putin forged ahead into isolation, unaware of the betrayals brewing. Building on that relentless cycle of sanctions and dwindling allies, where Russia grapples with a shrinking world of trade partners like China and India preying on its vulnerabilities, a stark reality emerges: Beijing holds Moscow in a stranglehold. Russia's astronomical losses: over 4,200 tanks destroyed or damaged, more than 8,500 armored vehicles lost, 700 armored personnel carriers gone, 411 infantry mobility vehicles obliterated, 300 command posts silenced, and countless artillery pieces, rocket systems, and missile defenses erased, demand mountains of resources to rebuild. Yet, despite ramping up domestic artillery production, gaps persist. Crisp winter winds howl outside Russian factories, tools clanging rhythmically, but the factories lack the gutsy microelectronics and optical devices China exclusively supplies. Moscow's reliance has skyrocketed, dependency on Beijing for critical chips, semiconductors, and sensors leapt from 32% in 2021 to 89% by 2023. China's tech edge, decades ahead, fuels Russia's war machine, yet trust erodes. An insider close to the Kremlin confided to Reuters: Beijing doesn't act as an ally. Payments halt unexpectedly, advantages slip away, borders on pure theft, nothing comradeship here. Putin's inner circle learns a bitter lesson: alienating the global stage costs dearly in rips and betrayals. But the sting deepens. Turkey follows suit, jacking up prices for Russian buyers by 25 to 55% over exports to others, the metal grind of machinery cutting through the profit margins. And India? Russia's next pillar, now hesitant, forcing Kremlin to slash crude oil prices, a $7 per barrel discount to Indian refineries, the lowest in 2 years, as shipments load in December. What if these heavy hits keep coming? Will Russia crumble under the weight? As sensory alarms blare in boardrooms, the acrid smell of desperation in the air, the tactile sting of tightening budgets, and unexpected twist unfolds, these price spikes aren't random. Experts warn they mirror rising sanctions bite, empowering China to charge premiums Russia can't evade. Touch that soil of isolation, feel the isolation's cold grip. Could this be the earthquake that ends the invasion? We dive deeper next, exploring if Russia's defenses hold against this predatory storm. In the previous part, Russia faced betrayal from China, where prices for vital supplies soared, forcing Moscow to pay exorbitant sums just to keep its war machine sputtering. But now, destiny's cruelty struck harder with India. Could Russia endure another ally turning into a ruthless exploiter? The shocking truth: India's hesitation pushed Russia to slash oil prices to desperation levels, a discount so deep it screamed weakness. Imagine the bitter sting of offers slashed by $7 per barrel, a price plummet so sharp it felt like a dagger to the Kremlin's fragile economy. This wasn't just business, it was humiliation, as Russia's prized Urals crude oil, the lifeblood funding tanks and missiles, was peddled at rock-bottom rates to anyone in India willing to bite. The roots of this desperate move? Teeth-gnashing sanctions gnawing at Russia's very soul. Western nations, tasting blood in the air, targeted the oil empire that propped up Putin's regime, accounting for a staggering 30% of Moscow's federal budget. The weight of isolation pressed down like a suffocating fog, oil exports choked, revenues bleeding out. In December 2022, the G7 slammed a $60 cap on Russian crude, a chain meant to bind. Yet, with crafty defiance, the Kremlin summoned a shadowy fleet of tankers, ghost ships slipping through cracks, uninsured and untethered. By 2024, 60% of Russia's oil slithered across waves on these phantoms, mocking the cap as if it were mere mist. What truly twisted the knife came next. NATO's shadows whispered of dire punishments, and on October 22, the United States unveiled its masterstroke. Unleashing sanctions on Russia's titans, Rosneft and Lukoil. Those towering names, symbols of power, now tainted and barred. The blow landed with brutal force. Russia's finance ministry numbers revealed oil tax receipts plummeting 27% in October alone compared to the year before. A gut-wrenching fall, a thud echoing through Putin's halls. And who suffered most? Indian refiners hesitated, fearing the dollar system's icy wrath, ready to eject them into exile if they dared touch Russian accounts sanctioned and forbidden. Here was the coded message: trade with these outcasts, and your world crumbles. The creak of tankers groaned on distant seas, the acrid scent of burning terminals hanging thick. Russia's desperation deepened. Did Putin foresee this abyss, this trap where allies became predators? As shadows lengthened over Moscow's skyline, whispers of impending collapse stirred. Would the next sanctions cave carve Russia's empire to dust? Would India abandon the sinking ship, leaving Putin with no escape? The world's gaze sharpened. Would this be the twist that broke the bear? Recent economic figures reveal a stark decline in Russia's oil revenues, plunging 27% in October compared to the previous year. This is no coincidence. The United States enacted a ruthless set of sanctions that targeted not just Russian companies but also any nations that dared to buy their resources after the deadline, November 21. Imagine the tense atmosphere as traders across the world froze. The streets of Moscow whispered of chaos, the scent of burning fuel thick in the air. Russian exports, once a vital bloodline, now faced an impossible dilemma. The oil, loaded at Novorossiysk port, traded at just $45.33 per barrel, its lowest point since March 2023. This was a strategic blow. Faced with sanctions that threatened to cut off their access to the dollar-based financial system, India's refiners started pulling back from Russian supplies. They feared being blacklisted, losing their access to global markets, and facing punishment from the West. The pressure was relentless. Russian exporters, desperate to preserve some semblance of their income, slashed prices drastically. They bet that cheaper oil might lure buyers back, yet, the game had changed dramatically. But here's the twist: India's refiners only want oil from sellers who aren't sanctioned, those who refuse to deal with the Russian giants like Lukoil or Rosneft. These two companies dominate around 80% of Russian exports currently offered to India. The remaining fraction is hardly enough to meet demand. So, despite deep discounts, India is cautious, risking everything by engaging only with non-sanctioned entities. This shows the full impact of Western sanctions. Even mighty economies like India's are wary. They recognize the hidden risks. A senior official from the U.S. Treasury confirmed this on November 20. Banks and businesses in China and India now shy away from accepting Russian deals that could jeopardize their ties with the West. Every transaction is scrutinized, every risk weighed in silence. The sanctions are working. Market data from November back this up. Russian revenues are shrinking. The price of Russian oil has plummeted, a clear blow to Moscow's war chest. The international effort to starve Putin's military machine is gaining ground. Analysts reveal that Urals crude has dropped at least 21% in recent weeks, a sign that the financial strangulation is cutting deep. But what's the real cost? As oil prices collapse, so does Russia's ability to sustain its war effort. The sound of money drying up echoes through Kremlin corridors. The question lingers: how long can Russia hold out before the economic pressure becomes unbearable? The answer might surprise you. Imagine the Kremlin, shrouded in icy fog, where Putin's once mighty war machine grinds to a halt, choking on isolation, Jivo crushed by sanctions from the West, walking when was Vladimir Putin's catastrophic decision to invade Ukraine in 2022, plunging Russia into economic abyss, where even allies bleed it dry. In this chilling saga, China exploits Russia's desperation, hiking prices on dual-use goods by 87%, forcing Moscow to pay through the nose while its military crumbles, over 4,200 tanks lost in Ukraine's fiery fields. Now, American sanctions tighten the noose, starving Putin's empire further. A pounding heart races as Russia's oil empire crumbles, discounts doubling, millions of barrels stranded adrift. How did Putin, the supposed unbeatable strategist, end up begging for scraps from Beijing and New Delhi? Rhetorically, what's worse, the stench of defeat or the taste of humiliation? Suddenly, a twist emerges. Putin's reliance on China soaks up his resources, but now India's turning away, leaving Russian oil begging at bargain basement prices. Feel the cold grip of despair as Ural's crude plunges 21% since October's sanctions, trading at a rock-bottom $45.33 per barrel on November 12. Its lowest since March 2023. The discount to Indian refineries ballooning from $3 to $7 a barrel. Smell the acrid smoke of burning bridges as 48 million barrels of Rosneft and Lukoil crude float stranded, untouchable, no buyer in sight. Hear the thunderous crash of shares, Lukoil's tumbling from $6,000 rubles, or $76.43, to $5,434 rubles, just $69.22, a brutal 9% nosedive. Rosneft's own collapse, from 402 rubles, $5.12, down to 374 rubles, $4.76. The empire hemorrhaging wealth. And pressure mounts as Lukoil flees, dumping $12 billion in assets, Bulgarian refineries, Romanian plants, Iraqi gas fields, Emirates production sites, even US and European gas stations, to a Swiss trader. Ruled by desperation, analysts like Sir Gutnift Bank's Saurabh Gupta whisper of 20 to 30% discounts in this fire sale, impossible without cutting losses. Is this the breaking point for Putin's illusion of power, where once virgin oil empires now lie ruined, and Ukraine's skies begin to clear? What shocking betrayal will unfold next? Will China and India slit Russia's throat completely, forcing Putin to kneel before Western wolves, ending the nightmare in screams muffled by snow? Or a hidden ally emerges from the frost, turning the tables on the sanctioning hunters? Stay tuned, the war's icy grip tightens, breaths shorten, hope falters. When the Russian leader made his bold move to invade Ukraine in 2022, he shattered his country's ties with the rest of the world. Western nations immediately condemned his actions. They imposed harsh sanctions, cutting off Russian banks, businesses, and key individuals. Diplomatic relations were severed, and global trade with Moscow plummeted. The world refused to cooperate, making Russia's path much more difficult. Yet, the invasion left Vladimir Putin stranded, isolated from most allies. As the months passed, it became clear Russia was losing its influence. Its once powerful economy was shrinking, battered by sanctions and diplomatic isolation. The Kremlin relied heavily on trade with China and India, two giants willing to buy Russian resources while others turned away. These Asian nations saw an opportunity, bloodless but strategic. They began bleeding Russia dry. Part by part, they chipped away at Moscow's remaining strength. And now, the true extent of this exploitation is unfolding. Let's start with China, the world's second-largest economy. Since the invasion, trade between the two countries has skyrocketed. Beijing has become Russia's lifeline, channeling vast sums into Russian energy, trade deals, and resources. Xi Jinping's government has refused to publicly condemn Putin, maintaining a neutral stance. No direct weapons shipments, yet China's financial backing has fueled the war effort. Without Chinese support, reports suggest Russia's economy would have collapsed long ago. Fueling the war machine, China has kept the Kremlin afloat even as Western nations tighten the screws. Beijing's role doesn't end there. New intelligence reveals it's raising prices for dual-purpose goods exported to Russia, products that could be used for civilian or military purposes. Think drones, software, chemicals, radar, sensors, all crucial for making weapons. China regularly supplies over $300 million worth of these high-priority items, more than half from just a few suppliers. Over the past year, the cost for Russia to purchase these goods has shot up nearly 87%, a staggering increase, while prices to other countries have barely risen by 9%. Moscow is being forced to pay a premium more and more, while its options dwindle. Why the steep rise? Western sanctions have restricted Russia's traditional trade routes. It can import key technology or manufactured components and must rely on China, its closest, yet most strategic, partner. But dependence comes at a price. Russia has had to cut back on imports of basic parts like ball bearings, costs up by 76%. The volume of these goods from China has dropped by 13%, a sign that Moscow is feeling the squeeze. The big picture? Sanctions are working, slowly but surely. Each new restriction makes trade more expensive. It's a calculated attack on Russia's war efforts. Many Western officials regard this as a win. By driving up the costs, they're choking Russia's ability to sustain its military campaign. The message is clear: if your resources become too costly or unavailable, your war machine grinds to a halt. And experts warn, Moscow's arsenal is suffering: tanks, armored vehicles, missile systems, each piece increasingly damaged or destroyed. In the shadows of this strategic economic war, China's role is critical. Yet, even as Beijing supports Moscow financially, many insiders say Beijing doesn't consider Russia a true ally. One Russian government source admitted, sometimes China lets us down, stops payments, takes advantage, even robs us. There's nothing true about that friendship. Meanwhile, other nations are joining the squeeze. Turkey has increased prices for Russian imports by 25 to 55% compared to other buyers. India, another vital partner, appears hesitant, offering Russian crude oil at record low prices to avoid sanctions' wrath. Moscow's energy exports are being watched, with risks, twists, and rising costs. Every step forward by the West, every new restriction, pushes Russia into a tighter corner. And the truth is, the more these sanctions bite, raising prices, restricting supplies, the worse Russia's war effort becomes. Its losses are staggering: tens of thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, and missile systems destroyed. Repairing or replacing them demands vast resources. Yet, Moscow's capacity is limited. It can't produce high-tech components like microelectronics or optical devices on its own. Dependence on China for chips and sensors has soared from 32% in 2021 to over 89% by 2023. Even within Russia, doubts are mounting. Officials see China's support as conditional, sometimes unreliable. One insider told Reuters, China isn't an ally. They betray us, they delay payments, take what they want, steal from us. We are alone, and it's costing us dearly. Meanwhile, other partners like Turkey have also ratcheted up prices. Even India is pulling back, offering crude oil at discounted rates just to keep trading alive, despite the risks. Through shattered alliances, rising costs, and relentless economic pressure, Russia's prospects become darker. Its war effort is under attack from every economic angle each day. The burden grows heavier. In this chess game of trade and sanctions, Moscow's future hinges on the patience and cunning of its enemies. The question remains, how much longer can the Kremlin sustain this fight when every resource becomes more expensive, and every ally turns colder? The stakes are higher than ever, and the endgame is still unwritten. Imagine the ruthless calculation behind Vladimir Putin's fateful choice in 2022. To unleash an invasion that severed Russia's ties with much of the world. Western nations unleashed a storm of condemnation, slamming sanctions on banks, businesses, and elites, cutting off all support for the Kremlin's bloody march into Ukraine. Left with a shrinking circle of allies and trade partners, Russia's options dwindled further as the conflict raged. Now, in a bitter twist of fate, nations like India and China, still buying Russian resources despite the chaos, exploit Putin's growing desperation. They bleed Russia dry, and the Kremlin stands powerless. The air in Moscow thickens with the sting of isolation, the metallic taste of defeat lingers on every tongue. What if I told you China's rising prices aren't just business, they're a deliberate stranglehold crushing Russia's war machine? Imagine the Kremlin elite sweating in shadowed rooms, the distant hum of unsanctioned engines mocking their dwindling arsenals. In the shadow of Putin's shrinking world, China emerges as Russia's lifeline, devouring coal and crude like a voracious beast. Since 2022, trade booms between them, with Xi Jinping dodging condemnation of the aggression. No weapons, no troops from Beijing directly fuel the fight, yet their purchases prop up the Kremlin's coffers, making the war sustainable. Without this lifeline, three-star General Sergei Rudskoy confessed in Reuters, Russia collapses, unable to arm troops or sustain the economy. China senses this grip, the cruel leverage in their hands. A Bank of Finland report exposes their cunning hike in prices for dual-use goods, rockets, drones, encryption tech that Russia desperately imports. The stench of exploitation fills the air as prices soar 87% for Moscow, while others pay just 9% more. Ball bearings? Up 76%, volumes slashed 13%. Sanctions strip Russia's choices, forcing reliance on Beijing for 89% of chips and sensors, once 32%. China cheats us, a Kremlin insider hissed, staging robberies like allies, never truly. The creak of empty vaults echoes. What humiliation comes next? Could Turkey and China's price gouging force Putin to his knees sooner than anyone dared imagine? Picture the war cries fading to whimpers of a cornered predator. China's not alone in this cruel game. Russia's sanction-stricken empire compels desperate oil discounts to India down to $7 per barrel, doubling the drop.